So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this session of the WTO Public Forum under the theme Facilitating Transit and Transport Operation in a Crisis Situation, Lessons Learned from COVID-19. As you all know, due to the global pandemic, countries imposed border restrictions in their efforts to combat the spread of the virus. As a result, world merchandise trade fell by 5.3% in 2020, and global supply chain faced with significant challenges. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, expectations were that seaborne trade, including containerized trade, would experience a strong downturn. However, changes in consumption and shopping patterns have led to increased import demand for consumer goods, a large part of which is moved in shipping containers. The increase in demand are stronger than expected, not met with a sufficient supply of shipping capacity. As a result of this, transit shipment and transport operations have been delayed, and the container freight rates significantly increased. In average, I have statistics here. That's 309% increase by September 2021 compared 1 year ago, September 2020. The landlocked countries, especially landlocked developing countries, hit very badly on that price increase. For instance, the price has grown 10 times in Bolivia for the transit containers and 6 times for Mongolia for their containers. Our session will address the challenges caused by shortage of containers and increase in the freight rates, and identify practical recommendations in this regard to facilitate transit and transport operations. For this task, we have today 4 distinguished panelists. First, Mr. Paul Hanson, Chief of Trade Facilitation Section of the UNCTAD. Then we have Ms. Viera Filipova, Technical Officer at the World Customs Organization from Brussels. Third, unfortunately, Ms. Toligon Landingot, Director of Operations at the International Think Tank for Landlocked Developing Countries in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, is unable to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances. However, Ms. Engtul Chansang Horol, researcher at the think tank, is going to participate today on his behalf. Then we have a representative of the private sector, Mr. Stephen Pope, Group Head of Trade Facilitation or Go Trade at the Deutsche Post and DHL. I thank all panelists for having accepted our invitation and joining us today virtually. As for the format of our session, first I will listen to each panelist's view on the topic of the session, about 6 minutes, and then when they're making interventions, I would like to ask our distinguished panelists to concentrate on the following questions. What are the lessons learned from this crisis? What solutions could be proposed to overcome the challenges we are facing today? What recommendations could be made not to repeat the current mistakes if the similar crisis situation occurs in the future? That is my questions asking the panelists, and I would like to first now invite Mr. Paul Hanson. So Paul Hanson is responsible for UNCTAD's trade facilitation portfolio. Paul has extensive experiences in trade and transport facilitation, having worked more than 20 years in UN system on issues such as international trade, transportation, transit, international standards, etc. He previously worked at the UNEC as secretary for the TR and International Harmonization Convention. Prior to joining the UN, Paul worked for more than 10 years in private sector in public affairs, management consulting, and logistics organizations. Paul, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and good morning. Thank you for the invitation to participate. I will share a short presentation, and I hope that you see it on the screen. So talking about the present crisis, we have clearly seen, as you indicated, Ambassador, increase in freight rates in connection with COVID-19, but not only in connection with COVID-19. There has been a number of other causes for this, and I think we all remember the blockage of the Suez Canal that happened also this year. So there are some causes for this. There has been more demand than expected also during the COVID crisis. Some of the main routes have changed and boxes were not where they needed to be at the time that they were requested. Carriers have skipped calls of ports in some cases. We have had a huge impact on personnel, obviously, COVID-19, and therefore handling in ports and hinterland dry ports have been very impacted. So this has led to a kind of vicious cycle. So those that have containers have held on to them, and again, the containers are not in the right place. And I think we can also see that the trade imbalance has certainly worsened. There are no boxes in China, and that has led to some of the problems. At the start of the crisis, UNCTAD has issued a action plan or call for action on a number of issues. There are 10 issues that have been highlighted. So ensuring uninterrupted shipping, maintain that ports and dry ports are open, protect international trade of critical goods, facilitate cross-border transport and collaboration and ensure the right of transit, which is particularly important to LLDCs. Safeguard transparency and up-to-date information needs to be there. I think the issue of going paperless or automation is extremely important. We needed also to address some of the legal implications, protect shippers, and finally ensure coordination. And on the last point, one of the issues that we have particularly seen of the stakeholders that we work with in UNCTAD, namely national trade facilitation committees, we have seen in some cases a near collapse of these national trade facilitation committees. National committees are there to coordinate implementation of trade facilitation, but due to the crisis, there has been a lack of meeting. It has simply not been possible. There has been a lack of a defined role of the NTFCs. There has been no guidelines in many cases in countries of teleworking, online meetings. Members have not had the necessary connectivity, and there has been an absence of focal points for crisis management. So all of these are issues that need to be addressed also for the future, so national committees can take up their role. There has to be political backing for this. There has to be increased professionalization of these committees, which includes also automation of their work in some cases. There has to be reform and alignment of national structures. And we believe that there has to be, importantly, links from NTFCs to regional organization and regional collaboration. UNCTAD has a program for this, working with national trade facilitation committees that we are rolling out with many countries. The other issue that, of course, we have seen as increasingly important is to avoid the person-to-person interaction. Automation, computerization, and digitalization is increasingly important and must happen not only because of COVID, but in order to optimize the supply chains. So promoting further paperless processing is something that we are focusing a lot on, amongst others in our ASECUDA program, which is a customs management program and trade integration program with single windows that is rolled out in more than 90 countries. And this is really what we think is important for the future, to have these processes automated between the trade community and the public sector. When we talk about trade facilitation and trade facilitation agreement of the WTO, I think it's important to notice some elements on the implementation. First of all, global implementation is moving forward, but has certainly been impacted by COVID-19. Many, especially least developed countries and developing countries, have had challenges in the implementation. And from UNCTAD, we would call on donors and supporters for trade implementation also to have that in mind in order to support countries and try and look at their challenges. LLDCs are lacking behind in implementation. We can see from the implementation rates that are self-declared. So there, I think there is an important element to look at. When we look at Article 11 of the TFA on freedom of transit, we also see that on the self-declared implementation, LDCs have a lower implementation rate at the present time than, for instance, transit countries. Now, the proof is in the pudding, and we need to see if that is actually the case. When we talk about trade facilitation and transit, of course, we have Article 11, where there are a number of issues that are outlined and should be implemented. But there are other issues in the trade facilitation agreement that are very important. Transparency, publication, authorized operators, border agency cooperation, implementation of single window, implementation of a well-functioning national trade facilitation committee. And one of the things that we have seen is also the establishment of national transit coordinators in order to enhance the communication between countries on transit. We believe that this is an important point. It is a best endeavor in the agreement, but we encourage all countries, all relevant countries, to appoint national transit coordinators, and we have a program for this. This is my last slide. There are a couple of points I would like to highlight. First of all, I think it's important that LLDCs move away from the victim scenario to the partnership scenario. Partnership with transit partners, partnership public and private stakeholders, looking at corridor solutions in partnership and developing their land linking role, and work in partnership in regional collaboration. Secondly, in my personal opinion, and UNCTAD feels this, LLDCs must first and foremost look at their national implementation and their national compliance, but this should be based on international legal instruments and good practices. Thirdly, transit is a right, but it is not unrestricted. And therefore, all operators, whether from landlocked countries or transit countries, must observe the rules of the country where they are transiting. We see way too often that rules are not being respected, and that creates problems, whether it's infrastructure-wise or other. I think one important issue is to try to avoid transshipment and reloading. It leads to delays, it leads to deterioration of goods, it leads to increased cost. Therefore, containerize to the maximum, and maybe use of dry ports and establishment of dry ports and in strategic positions is an important issue also to be addressed. We have seen that boxes and containers are not in the right places. How can we achieve better container returns and empty container returns? Well, maybe one issue is to have some kind of system whereby container guarantee system is in place so that the users are not keeping containers, but actually circulate these containers. And if not, then somehow they're penalized. But it also has to be facilitated, and therefore a global container guarantee system could be a possibility. Increase competition, avoid some of the restrictive measures that are in place today. Transport permit system, freight syndicates, all lead to increased cost and having intermediaries that are maybe not contributing much to transit. And finally, I think there are two game changers in transit: data interconnectivity, automation, and guarantee portability to replace some of those solutions that are in place today. It could also be by tracing and tracking. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I'm of course ready to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation. So I would like to now invite our next speaker, Ms. Viera Filippova from the Procedures and Facilitation Subdirectorate of the World Customs Organization. World Customs Organization is the voice of international customs community. Its mission is to enhance the effectiveness and the efficiency of customs administration, which is very important during the pandemic time. So, Ms. Filippova, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and thank you also for inviting the World Customs Organization to this important session to discuss facilitating transit and transport in crisis situations. Customs is an important part of the international trade infrastructure. I would like to start my intervention by briefly exploring what customs can do to mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. In April last year, the WCO issued a document in which we highlighted certain measures and best practices implemented by our members. The fourth edition of this document is based on information provided by 115 members, 21 of which LLDCs. So first of all, the role of customs is to facilitate the cross-border movement of relief and essential supplies, including COVID-19 vaccines. What we did to support our members was to develop, in cooperation with the World Health Organization, lists of essential goods, together with an indication of their 6-digit tariff classification. These lists helped our members worldwide to treat the goods on the list with priority and facilitate their customs clearance. Second, in the response to the pandemic, customs had to support the economy and sustain supply chain continuity. The reasons for the shortages of containers during the pandemic are very complex, but include disruptions to the supply chain continuity and port congestion, among others. Throughout the pandemic, the WCO was advocating for facilitating of the cross-border movement, not only of relief goods, but goods in general, to help minimize the overall impact of COVID-19 on economies and societies. The third and fourth imperative for customs are to protect their staff and to implement measures to protect the society. What is cross-cutting and of paramount importance is implementing coordinated border management and digitalization of customs process. The next slide shows some lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic proved the importance of pre-established, simple, and efficient customs procedures. What was also important was further streamlining and simplifying border procedures in response to the pandemic, such as establishing green lanes for freight transport, facilitating the movement of cargoes along transit corridors, among others. In terms of coordination and cooperation, I would like to stress the need for a real whole-of-government approach that is not driven solely by sanitary considerations. This includes facilitating of the movement of goods inland. Coordination with the neighboring countries is also very important, especially coordination between LLDCs and transit countries, as well as coordination at the regional level. Making publicly available information on measures and procedures introduced in response to the pandemic is of paramount importance, as is the digitalization of custom processes and paperless procedures. The COVID-19 pandemic proved that those members that had completed their modernization reforms and were implementing the relevant international standards could reap the benefits of those reforms. In terms of relevant international legal basis, I would like to mention the WCO revised Kyoto Convention, the full name for which is the International Convention on the Simplification and Harmonization of Customs Procedures. The RKC was extensively referred to in the process of negotiating the Trade Facilitation Agreement of the World Trade Organization, and implementing the RKC can support implementation of the TFA as well. As of today, the RKC has 182 contracting parties, 22 of which are landlocked developing countries, which is 69% of the total number of LLDCs. The WCO is fully aware of the specific challenges faced by LLDCs, such as remote, limited access to international markets. We believe that the key to unlocking the potential of LLDC is the implementation of international standards for efficient transit regimes. The WCO transit guidelines contain 150 guiding principles in that area, which are of importance not only to LLDCs but also for transit countries. The transit guidelines support members in implementing Article 11 of the TFA, the Vienna Program of Action for LLDCs, the Customs Convention on Containers, and other international legal instruments. The Transit Compendium illustrates in practical terms how transit guidelines are implemented by members. It contains a total number of 34 best practices. 12 of them deal with transit policy issues in LLDCs. Since last year, the WCO is developing a new tool in the area of transit by rail that will be supplemented by a harmonized data set for customs transit by rail. My last slide shows the areas in which the WCO supports the implementation of the Vienna Program of Action. We do this by developing tools, by providing capacity building support to the customs administrations of LLDCs, and by upholding the cooperation with other international organizations and private sector associations. In terms of trade facilitation, we have a wide array of tools that we use under the WCO Mercator program to support our members in implementing the TFA. In terms of digital connectivity and ICT, we support members with the WCO data model, as well as some other tools, such as the framework of standards on cross-border e-commerce. I would like to also mention here the SAFE framework of standards to secure and facilitate global trade, which is the tool that introduced the concept of authorized economic operator. And we also have a number of tools and initiatives to support our members in the response and recovery from natural disasters and public health emergencies. This afternoon from 1:30 to 2:30, the WCO is organizing session 29 in the public forum under the theme Customs Bolstering Recovery, Renewal and Resilience for a Sustainable Supply Chain. This session will explore in further detail the aspects that I touched upon in this brief presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Filippova, for your presentation. So I would like now give the floor to Ms. Engtol Jansanghoral from the International Think Tank for Landlocked Developing Countries based in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. The ITT for LLDCs was officially launched in 2009 by United Nations Secretary General in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. This think tank serves as a recognized need for landlocked developing countries. It provides a center of excellence for landlocked developing countries by using top quality research that will translate into policy formulation and ultimately into the action. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Engtol. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sorry, I have to share my screen, right? Please. My screen is shared, right?
So we could not see yet.
Oh. Someone should enable it, right?
No, not yet.
Oh, no, it's okay.
So
Right?
it's coming now. Good, good. Now
Thank you.
go ahead.
Thank
please.
you for your patience. Let me explain a little bit about how to facilitate transit and transport in landlocked developing countries. Of course, everyone knows that the situation is terrible here and there, everywhere in the world. So I would like to say that in short as possible as and the impact of COVID-19 on transport sector in landlocked developing countries. The overall economic impact of the pandemic reflected in the negative economic growth rates estimated in all LLDCs for the year of 2020. The limited diversification of economic activities in many landlocked developing countries with a greater commodity dependence leave them more vulnerable than ever to new shocks like this pandemic. As 26 out of 32 landlocked developing countries are dependent on primary commodities for more than 30% of their exports. The pandemic has resulted in significant slowdowns in the movement of goods and services, which has affected the trade potential of landlocked developing countries. Even though the many landlocked developing countries and transit countries have initiated lifting some of the restrictions in favor of partial closure or certain exemptions. Impact of the COVID-19, the transport sectors and logistics industry, which play a crucial role in the economies of many LLDCs, have experienced unprecedented impact of containment measures, travel restrictions, and border closures due to the pandemic. For example, the air transport industry was hit hardest as airlines had fewer international air travelers in 2020 and 62% of drop in airline passengers compared to the 2019 due to the coronavirus pandemic and subsequent travel restrictions that resulted in shutdown of number of global roads. Decrease in road freight was reported in all regions, and rail freight transport was largely exempted from the restriction measures, but operators reported a reduction of freight volumes of 20 to 50% due to the economic slowdown. Consultation meetings we had last May in Mongolia and the private sector stakeholders identified some problems related to the pandemic. There is a need to review and revise the regulations, rules, and policies on transport and logistic development and investment. And also it's required to establish transshipment platforms at the ports and build logistic terminals along the railway. And the better cooperation between the public and private entities should be enhanced. And there is no data, exact data, registration information, and study results are found. Also, harmonization of the requirement for the better border inspections and customs documents with the neighboring countries are required. It's required to cooperate with the transit neighbors to regulate the imports to Mongolia. In May 2021, about 5,000 Mongolian containers were stuck at the port of Tianjin, China, due to the pandemic. It leads to the sharp rise in shipping prices and further shortages, rise in commodity prices, and the inability to find the rental containers for Mongolian transportations. Even though there is some best practices supporting the transit and transport in landlocked Balkan countries, last March we had virtual meetings with the representatives of the United Nations RCO offices in landlocked Balkan countries and regional initiatives that successfully supported the countries have identified. For example, the United Nations Economic Commissions in Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean that operates the COVID-19 observatories that provides the interactive data. And also there is a green lanes established between the SEPTA and European Union countries that help to keep freight traffic flowing and help meet the food security needs. Also, the green gateway between Mongolia and China was established as a temporary solution, and it allowed greater transport access to both countries. And also, the Mongolia acceded to the Asia-Pacific Trade Agreement, and it helped accelerated implementation of China and Russia economic corridors. The next part of my presentation is about the way forward for better recovery for landlocked Balkan countries. Of course, we know the key recommendations to the landlocked Balkan countries' resilience and sustainable recovery from the pandemic. Firstly, ensure that LLDCs are not left behind on access to vaccines. And secondly, intensify regional cooperation and ensure that trade and transport corridors remain open. And also, LLDCs should seek to digitalize their transport mechanism to ensure the safe and uninterrupted processing in cross-border transit. The strengthening of global supply chain for the landlocked Balkan countries is important for ensuring adequate flow of essential goods like medicines and food. For the transit and transport sector recovery, we are proposing the following recommendations. It's based on the studies recently completed with the United Nations office, and these recommendations are that landlocked developing countries and transit countries are encouraged to keep cross-border transport networks for goods and supply chains open, while protecting the safety of transport workers and citizens to maintain the integration of LLDCs into the world trade. Secondly, public and private sectors, including border agencies, need to work closely together to facilitate transport and proper functioning of supply chains. Governments and border and customs agencies should work together to simplify and facilitate and fast-track clearance of critical essential goods. Given that 80% of the international trade is transported by sea, the public and private operators in coastal and transit countries need to ensure the ports remain open and provide the necessary services for international trade, protecting public health. And the next one is greater use of trade facilitation standards and digital technologies that limit physical checks in transit, physical contact at borders, and protect the health of workers. Ensure transparency and information availability about import, export, and transit procedures in order to secure the smooth flow of goods, as well as enhance sharing of trade and transit related information between the countries. LLDCs and transit countries need to cooperate more on transit and transport along their important corridors, especially. International cooperation is important for setting the global guidelines and framework for harmonization of public health and safety measures at the border ports. Transit countries and regional organizations should support smooth functioning of transit, transport, and trade corridors and ensure freedom of transit in line with provisions of international framework and conventions. Development partners, United Nations, and other international and regional organizations need to urgently set up capacity building and technical assistance to LLDCs in support of trade facilitation, transport services, and logistics solutions. Efforts should be made to preserve investments to the improved transport connectivity during the course of the pandemic. There is a need to develop efficient support transport system, smooth functional transit, transport and trade corridors, which are resilient to crisis. A strong rule-based multilateralism is critical, including a commitment to maintain open and free trade, a commitment to keep open borders with restrictions only for clean reasons. Emergency measures designed to tackle COVID-19 must be transparent, targeted, proportionate, and consistent with World Trade Organization rules. These are the main recommendations, which is based on our studies and which is based on the consultations with the landlocked development countries, UN representatives' offices. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Engtul, giving us the insights from the landlocked developing countries' point of view, also about the situation in Mongolia, and then also lessons learned. So let's move to our last but not least speaker today. I'd like to invite Ms. Stephen Pope. Stephen is group head of the trade facilitation, Go Trade at Deutsche Post DHL, and has been with the group for 10 years, originally joining in 2011 at DHL Express as Vice President, Customs and Regulatory Affairs for Europe, and then head of trade compliance for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Before joining the Deutsche Post DHL, Stephen spent 26 years in the public sector, working for Her Majesty Customs and Treasury, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and IMF. He has worked also both in enforcement and policy areas on topics such as customs and international trade. Stephen sits on a number of the public and private trade advisory groups and think tanks, both in European and global level. Is also a member of the steering group of the German and Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation and UNDP COVID-19 Private Sector Global Facility. So, Mr. Pope, floor is yours, please. Mr. Pop, you hear me? It seems we have bit technical problem, but before I saw the steam pop, but now is interrupted. But please wait few minutes. So I think now the line is reestablished. He will go into on now. Mr. Pop, please, the floor is yours. You hear me? So we're trying to establish also the line of the steam pop. So maybe we should continue maybe our discussion then now, not losing time to waiting for steam pop, but I would like maybe come back to the presentation from Paul Hanson. So you pointed out the two things. I think coordination is important. Also, that was in presentation of Ms. Engtool. Presentation coordination inside the country among the authorities. Also, coordination with the neighbors and the regional coordination, especially with the transit countries. So, as you know, we have the trade facilitation agreement, the WTO, and we have the Article 11.17 about the appointment of the National Transit Coordinator. And as I know, only 2 countries voluntarily, as today, I think is notified, is the Mongolia and the Kyrgyzstan. And I wanted to ask the Paul Hanson how we could then encourage the others to do that appointment of the National Transit Coordinator voluntarily. How we could encourage that one? How you any ideas on that? Please, Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And yeah, I think, as you said, all the speakers have stressed the issue of collaboration, whether that is at national level or bilaterally, regionally, or internationally. We certainly think that the issue of national transit coordinators are important. As I mentioned in my intervention, the article on National Transit Coordinator, Article 11.17 of the WTO TFA, is a best endeavor. It's an encouragement, and therefore some countries may not view this as a necessity. However, I think we all know that in transit, it is extremely important that there is a flow of information crossing several borders is in itself a challenge, and therefore having at governmental national level national transit coordinators that can communicate and try and solve some of these issues is important. I mean, I can give an example. We saw a couple of years ago in one of the African regions, suddenly one country implemented without any notification a new regulation that prohibited some import and transit of certain goods types. Nobody else knew about it. Nobody knew who to turn to, except for their embassies and their missions in countries. And as you know, this can take some long time. Have we had national transit coordinators that were networked at that point of time, this issue could maybe have been dealt with much faster and in a better way. Now, what can we do in order for other countries to appoint national transit coordinators? First of all, I think there are a little more than 2 countries that have appointed national transit coordinators, but I agree with you that there are not as many as there should be, not nearly. From UNCTAD's side, we have seen this as a very important point, and that's also why we have established and are offering the training course at regional levels for national transit coordinators. We have done this in several African sub-regions, East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa. We have done this in Central Asian countries, but I think we need to roll this out in collaboration with others, obviously, in many other regions where there is a natural transit cooperation. And once countries have awareness of the benefits of having national transit coordinators, I think it will be a virtual, so to say, or cycle of seeing the benefits, appointing national transit coordinators, assisting them to define what is it a national transit coordinator does, and assisting them in notifying this to the WTO. We have also talked to WTO and trying to re-emphasize this.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I think for your also opinions, also informations. So I think now Stephen Pope is back online, and then I would like to invite him now, please. Mr. Pope, you have the floor now.
Stephen, we can see you at least.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, apologies. I'm having horrendous technical problems. I'm actually in my office, which is ridiculous. Yeah, apologies. Thank you, Ambassador. Shall I just speak now, or are you going through the Q&A now?
Yes, please, floor is yours. First your presentation, and then we're going to, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, and apologize for that. It's yeah, right. So I know a number of points have already been raised by UNCTAD and WCO and also by the think tank. I think the key thing is a lot of the problems that we see in transit countries and least developed landlocked countries are obvious. But I think what the pandemic has done is it's really emphasized the challenges that are faced. And if I just approach it from a practical perspective for us as a transport and logistics company, you know, I'll start firstly with infrastructure. What we often see is the road networks are not particularly good. Rail networks in some areas are non-existent. So what you see is that goods that would normally be transported by rail end up going by road. And then you have further congestion, not only because the roads are of poor quality, but of course the other infrastructure such as bridges, etc. So that is a major challenge that we have. From a regulatory perspective, there's been congestions for years at the borders, not only with the landlocked countries, but with the transit countries as well. Landlocked countries has been emphasized already this morning, are highly dependent on the ports. they need to get to the ports. And of course, what we face are delays because of differing regulation in each country, different documentation requirements, needs for permits. I think, Paul, you mentioned it about the need for offload and onload in some areas, and of course, a lack of harmonization between the agencies themselves. Customs infrastructures are often still manual paper-based instead of digital, which is creating additional challenges today. So those are already areas that are highly obvious. Paul, you mentioned the TFA, so did Viera as well, and the revised Kyoto Convention, and I'll touch on those in a minute because they are key finding a way to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think I want to just quickly touch on containers. It's been mentioned already this morning. What we're seeing is, if you talk to the industry, they're going to say that Q4 this year, there won't be a peak in container traffic. We're already there. So what we've seen with the increasing demand is that a number of shippers, exporters and importers have tried to bring orders and movements forward to try and flatten the demand. But of course, what that has done is it's just increased the demand on the capacity earlier on in the year. So Q2, we were ending up in record areas. Now, of course, the other delays that we had as well, the impact has been on that traffic is that a number of ports were shut because of the pandemic, or there were restricted delays. And so containers were either not getting to the ports, were in the ports and stuck in the ports, or they weren't leaving the ports. So that was a number of areas that we've seen. And of course, and the market is virtually almost at 100% already. I think for the LLDCs, what we've seen, and I think that was already mentioned by the colleague at the International Think Tank, is the reliance heavily on many LLDCs on commodities for exports. And what you've seen is the demand has gone down. So exports have gone down in these countries. But of course, imports have gone up because they've had to bring in essential goods. And that has been a major challenge for them in terms of their economic stability as well. So what have we been doing within Deutsche Post DHL? And in this area, in this context, I want to focus very much on the business of DHL Global Forwarding that tend to move most of the goods that are impacted in this area. And what we've been trying to do is utilize a multimodal solution where rail has played a major role in that. So what we've been doing is looking at direct rail connections between China and Europe via transit countries, including Mongolia. We've also been looking at sea rail as well, moving from Japan, Korea, China to the ports in the east of Russia, such as Vladivostok, and then moving the goods on rail through Russia into Europe. And we've been opening up new routings as well in different borders, such as the Ukrainian-Polish border through Kaliningrad, trying to bypass some of the congested areas and maximize the opportunity to move goods through. We've also implemented, or we've been utilizing China to UK rail short sea solution from Xi'an to Immingham. And where we can, using trucking solutions from China to Europe. So one of the advantages, of course, with COVID, with the rail network is the lack of human interaction that's needed in terms of health and safety. So that has been a major advantage for certainly for moving equipment, essential goods to where they're needed. And the other thing that we've been looking at is offering the opportunity for those that don't have the capacity to take a full container, take part space within the container as well. In other words, moving from SCL to LCL to ensure that as much cargo is moving as possible. We're being as flexible as we can be with the container usage. And the other thing that we've been doing is we've been pushing containers eastbound. This is an issue that you raised, Paul, is we've been pushing containers eastbound via rail back through into Asia to get them back there as quickly as possible. So I want to quickly touch on some of the areas that were raised. And I firstly touched to ones raised by Paul and UNCTAD around the NTFCs. you mentioned the NTFCs. In all honesty, there's never been a more important time for the operation and engagement with an NTFC than now, with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's not just that some of the NTFCs are broken down because the digital infrastructure hasn't been there to move from meeting rooms to offline. It's also in some countries, the governments haven't been engaging with the private sector. So the MTFCs also are not being populated by the private sector. Well, if you look at the TFA, it's openly encouraged that there is a public-private dialogue, and NTFCs have to play an essential role in there in the government's understanding what the demands are for the private sector in order to keep goods moving, but also, just as importantly, that the private sector understands the challenges and the demands that the government face. That way, if the public and private sector are sitting in the room discussing the challenges that they're facing, they're far more likely to come up with workable solutions to ensure that goods are moving as essentially as they can. I want to then touch on on digitalization. What we've seen is that those countries that moved quickly to digitalization, even adapting things like PDF documents on email, they were far more effective in ensuring that they keep as much commerce moving or goods moving across borders as possible. And I think, you know, this has been mentioned as well previously about the advantage of digitalization in terms of protecting border officials and the shippers, exporters, lorry drivers, etc., and moving across the border. Minimizing human impact minimizes the opportunity for the pandemic to spread. And of course, digitalization speeds up processes as well. So that is the key area. And of course, you know, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the revised Kyoto Convention. In this area, I want to commend the WCO. Viara Filipova mentioned about the WCO working together with the World Health Organization on coming up with a list of essential medical goods. Actually, the WCO went further than that. They engaged with the WTO, engaged with a number of stakeholders, including the private sector via signing an MOUs and discussions with John Denton for the ICC, for the International Chamber of Commerce. And the WCO has created a magnificent website in terms of everything that you can do. And even including how you set up committees to deal with the pandemic, easy guidelines and implementation of the RKC, what assistance is there, and also the benefit of the TFA. And as Viara rightly pointed out, if you look at many elements within the TFA, they are actually built around the immediate release guidelines of the RKC. So there are the key areas there. And again, if you look at UNCTAD as well, between UNCTAD and WCO, for anybody looking to implement the necessary reforms that we need, and they are necessary, these aren't nice to do, these are need to do reforms. In order to ensure that we minimize the impact, the opportunity is there together with a number of agencies, but more importantly, looking at websites like the WCO and UNCTAD and what is available in terms of guidance on information and what can be done. Now, Paul mentioned earlier about trade facilitation. Trade facilitation is still ongoing with us. We have at the moment, I think we have over 30.
Mr. Pop, now we have left only 2 minutes.
Apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. And then really, I'm agreed that one of the solutions is the digitalization. And then I think that is the main target, which the LLTCs also should look on that. I have one question, maybe we have left only 1 minute, and then I'm going to quickly ask then maybe Paul and then also the Mr. Filipova. That's we heard all from the speakers about how the current situation with containers shortages and high shipping costs is having a very negative effect on the LLTC state. The situation seems to be mostly due to the market failure and the less regulatory obstacles. Given that the WTO rules mostly addresses regulatory issues, what can be done at the multilateral level by WTO, UNCTAD, and CEO to address the problem. I'm going to give floor first to Ms. Filippo, and then you have the only maybe half minute, and then Paul, you have the concluding. Please, Ms. Filippo.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. So what we are, the area that we are competent in is trade facilitation, and the takeaway from this session should be implement the existing legal, international legal framework, the TFA, the RKC, what is out there for members to do their modernization reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think one of the issues around the containers and boxes and the shortage is that we somehow need to ensure better circulation of these containers. As I said in my intervention, there are containers that are being kept, there are containers that are not returned. I think Stephen also confirmed this. It may be worthwhile that we in the international community look at some kind of measure to improve this circulation of containers, whether that is to have a guarantee system or a system of tracking better the containers, working together between shipping lines and maybe some authorities. I am not quite clear yet, but I think there are opportunities. And as Stephen said, working between governments, international institutions, and the private sector to ensure this is a sine qua non. Thank you.
Thank you very much for our panelists. So unfortunately, the time is over, and then I should now conclude the session. Thank you. That was very useful and interesting talks today. And I hope that in the following sessions, all the participants will be going to also focus on that problem. And in 2 days, also again, another session about the productivity of the landlocked developing countries. But for others, very emerging issue is, of course, transport, not only for the LLDCs, also for the overall the world. As you know, that's as I mentioned in the start, that overall in the world average, that the container price is increased 309%. That is emerging and alarming issue also for the WTO. With that, I would like to conclude and then thank again for all the participants and also especially the panelists. Thank you again and have a nice day.